And then, you know, that obviously continues. Okay, so that's the Gilded Age. Ladies and gentlemen, want to look at this progressive era of the early 1900s, 1900 to 1960, 1916 is what I have listed here. You know, just sort of a rough period. As I said, this is very much an age of reform. We talked about reform efforts of the 1830s and 40s. This is similar in some ways, different in others. So let's look at this. So as these cities grow and these industries are growing and there's larger factories and more people working in them and more industries and there's no regulations, what happens is you see a group of journalists that will go into some of these places and start to expose the problems with the lack of regulation, right? And start to depict in detail why this is so problematic. One of the most famous examples is Upton Sinclair's work, The Jungle, published in 1906. And a very influential novel, which he sets sort of the setting for this, is meatpacking industry. And in here, so he did research, he investigates, he goes undercover, he looks at the stuff and uncovers unsanitary slaughterhouses, uncovers rotten meat, tainted meat that's been sold to American consumers, and no one, I mean, the government's not monitoring this, right, and regulating it. And when people learn about this, they are freaked out and they are ticked, right? They are angry that this happened. It was happening. So it's not a coincidence that the same year this book is published is the same year federal government passes the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. It's a direct response to the work of some of these journalists and pointing out the problems, right? That these things need to be regulated. These industries need to be held accountable. So muckrakers is the term that actually Teddy Roosevelt used to describe people that they were raking up the muck, right? They were exposing sort of the underside of American life. So important, right? Writers that are bringing about change. Another development, and this sort of goes at connected with the industrial technological changes, is these larger cities will also become places of consumption, more and more consuming that will take place. The United States is becoming more and more of a consumer nation, and mass consumption becoming a more common thing. So you have chain stores, you have downtown department stores, you have retail outlets, you have catalogs for those people who are living in more rural areas so that they can still engage in this consumption. Here's kind of what people were doing. By 1910, Americans can purchase, among other things, electric sewing machines, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, record players, all of this. Of course, because of income inequality and, you know, a lot of working class people can't afford all of this stuff. So a lot of times we look at like post-World War II as the United States really becoming sort of a mass consumer society. But the process is very much beginning in the early 1900s with these developments in these stores. Also, what we start to see is more leisure activities, right? People who are able to afford it, places where they can go and spend some of their income, amusement parks, dance halls, theaters. These become places for crowds who live in cities. So the most popular form of entertainment around 1900, around the turn of the century, was vaudeville. Vaudeville show, you can think of basically like a variety show. Any act could be a part of vaudeville almost. So like one night, right, one vaudeville show could have a musician, could have acrobats, could have a magician, could have like an animal act, all a part of it, right, all a part of it. And with motion pictures, right, with films becoming this new sort of technology, they were integrated into vaudeville. However, as the motion picture industry begins to become more elaborate and the technology more sophisticated, there are separate theaters that are created just to show films for the first time. Right? And these will attract millions of Americans, right? So by 1910, 25 million Americans per week, and most of these people are working class urban residents, are attending these movies. at theaters known as Nickelodeon theaters. And it's called a Nickelodeon theater because it cost a nickel, right? 5 cents. That's where the term Nickelodeon comes from. So you can see here, hopefully my mouse is showing up, but on the sign right there, it says 5 cents. So that is something working class people can afford, right? You can, they can spare that, right? They can spare a nickel and go and see these movies. Whereas vaudeville, that's more expensive, right? That was more of an upper class form of leisure activity. So I want to play a clip just to give you a sense of what people were going to see. Here's a scene from an early film called The Great Train Robbery from 1903. So acting has changed a little bit. Hopefully you're able to hear, I mean, it's silent, but I want to be able to hear the music. Let me jump to my favorite part of this. So he's wailing on him, wailing on him, wailing on him. It cuts, and now it's clearly a dummy. And he throws the dummy off. Technology has changed in a lot of ways. Certainly in the film industry, acting is a bit different these days than it was then. But that maybe not riveting for you, riveting for people in the early 20th century. Think about like how mind-boggling that has to be, right? Just the idea of a moving image when that didn't exist before, right? That's not a technology existed. Photography, relatively new in and of itself. For you to go to a theater and then see something like that had to be mind-blowing, right? You sort of understand why millions of people would go and see something like that every week. Okay, so with these increased public spaces, increased industries, increased jobs, growing cities, women in the public sphere becomes more and more of a common sight. More women are working in various occupations. Obviously, there's still going to be limits. Obviously, African-American women are not going to be able to take up some of the same opportunities white women are engaged in. A lot of, at this point, African-American women, most of them involved in either domestic service of some kind or working still in fields, right? Still involved as sharecroppers, immigrant women confined to, low-paying factory jobs, all of that stuff. But overall, more women engaged in work outside the home, in the public sphere, and this becomes used as a symbol, right? The symbol of female emancipation. It becomes used by women's rights activists to their benefit. Of women out there in the public more, okay, well now they want access to more things. They want to be recognized in different ways and continue to break down various barriers. So this, in turn, leads to what we call the feminist movement, sort of the first wave of the feminist movement, this new kind of feminism. This is the era in which feminism first enters the public vocabulary, right? Feminism as a word. There was actually a meeting held in 1914 in New York called, and the title of like this conference was, "What is feminism?" Literally, just like, what is this term? Let's define it. One speaker said it meant women's emancipation, both as a human being and a sex being. So this is combining sort of more traditional women's rights, access to the ballot, access to voting, to jobs, to education, with more open conversations about sexuality, which was not something that sort of the more traditional women's rights movement engaged in. It's merging these two things. right? Talking about, pointing out double standards when it comes to sexuality, women compared to men, and doing this in a public way through magazines, through debates, through theater, right? Through experimental theater, through poetry. You see this this new brand of feminism. It's rooted in this progressive era. So then those things combined of women who are working in the public sphere more, and now this new feminist movement with more open conversations about sexuality, not surprising that you also see a movement regarding birth control, of women demanding more open access to it, even just more information about birth control. So a little bit of context at this time. Most states around the turn of the century, 1900, either birth control was illegal, the sale and distribution of birth control illegal, but also providing information about it. Right? There's laws where you couldn't distribute anything that talked about birth control in the mail, for instance. There's federal laws responding to this. So this movement seeks to change it. So I know this is awkward, right? Awkward moment where your history professor talks to you about birth control, but hopefully it will make sense to you. So controlling one's own body, that's part of this as well in this new brand of feminism. So two women I wanted to highlight, really important in this birth control movement: Emma Goldman, Margaret Sanger. So Emma Goldman immigrates to the United States from Lithuania when she's 16, becomes involved in this cause, will tour the country giving various speeches, including frequently arguing that Americans needed to have a more enlightened view when it came to homosexuality and how it was perceived. And she often talked about the right to birth control in these speeches, providing information about it. This is a quote from Emma Goldman. "I demand freedom for both sexes, freedom of action, freedom of love, and freedom in motherhood." She constantly runs up against the law for giving these speeches, right? In this public way, there's laws stopping, as I said, distributing information, talking about these things. There's a one count that she's